Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Late Saturday night, Dan Lanning, the Oregon Ducks, sound to have found their guy as the next wide receivers coach heading into 2025, as former Syracuse wide receivers coach Ross Douglas making the trip across the country, joining this Oregon Ducks program going into 2025. Now, to the Oregon fans who've been rocking with the boys the last couple of weeks, we talked about, I believe, last Sunday. When Junior Adams took the job with Dallas, we started, just spitballing some names that would be intriguing for Dan Lanning and the Oregon Ducks to go look at. We did talk about Ross Douglas. Now, as much as I would like to think Dan Lanning listens to the boys, I think this is just an example of it. I had a teacher tell me this one time, you know, blind squirrel finds a nut once in a while. That's probably the example we're looking at here. I really do like Ross Douglas. We talked about him a little bit on last Sunday. We're going to talk a lot about him over the next couple of minutes. What it looks like Dan Lanning's doing is something we've seen him do throughout his tenure at Oregon. That is, let's take some shots at some young position coaches that we think are guys. And it's worked out a couple of times for Dan Lanning, right? I think Alik Terry on the offensive line when he came to Oregon, really young offensive line coach, that the small sample size that we saw of Alik Terry was good, but I think he had some question marks about him coming to Oregon. Obviously worked out in a big way. Kind of did a similar thing with Rashad Samples 12 months ago, bringing him in. Dan Lanning wants to bet on young, hungry position coaches that are going to be dogs on the recruiting trail that also have shown that they can develop good football players. If you can do those two things, and this is probably where it starts, is when we evaluate position coaches, we look at two things. One, can you recruit elite talent? Ross Douglas at 30 years old, you feel really good about what he can do on the recruiting trail, especially with that Oregon logo on his chest. Secondly, can you develop talent? In the small sample size we've seen of Ross Douglas, specifically at Syracuse, he did a phenomenal job. I mean, this Syracuse passing attack, it was the number one passing offense in the country in the 2024 year. Yes, Kyle McCord was very good at the quarterback spot. You saw some elite play from a bunch of wide receivers over that 2024 year. So you're getting a 30-year-old coach that you think is young, energetic, should be able to recruit at a high level, and has shown that he can develop wide receivers top-notch. It's hard not to like this hire. And there's maybe some more question marks about this hire as opposed to maybe some of the other names we talked about, but this could be one of those young rising stars that Dan Lanning loves to add to his staff. And that's one of the things Dan Lanning does not get nearly enough credit. It seems like everybody wants to kind of nitpick what Dan Lanning's doing, blaming all his success on NIL money. Yeah, Oregon is competitive with NIL. One of the things Dan Lanning has historically done a phenomenal job with is hiring a staff around him. You look at this coaching staff, Alik Terry, Rashad Samples, you look on the defensive side of the football, it's loaded. There's a lot of really good coaches on the staff, and that's playing a large part in Oregon's success, not only on the football field, but on the recruiting trail as well. And that falls with Dan Lanning. One of the things that it's not always flashy to talk about in this era of college football with the portal and NIL, it's coaching staffs. Nick Saban, Kirby Smart, some of the greatest coaches we've seen the last decade. What do they all have in common? They make really good hires around them. I think Dan Lanning's doing a really good job of this early during his tenure in Eugene. Now, I want to get into Ross Douglas, talk about what he brings on the recruiting trail, what he brings as a coach. Before we get into it, as always, to the Oregon fans, would love to hear how you guys are feeling. This is probably one that I think a lot of Oregon fans probably had to Google real quick. He's not necessarily the biggest wide receiver coach name in college football, but I think there's a lot to like about this hire. Let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. Now, general background of Ross Douglas, and as a Michigan fan, I'm familiar with Ross Douglas, right? 30 years old, very, very young. Has spent some time in the NFL with the New England Patriots, played his football at Michigan and Rutgers during his playing career, from Ohio. One of the things that jumps out, let's start with what he can do on the recruiting trail first, and that is he's 30 years old, did a nice job recruiting for Fran Brown at Syracuse, and we haven't seen Ross Douglas in a position like Oregon, right? You get a young, energetic, charismatic coach, and you put that Oregon Duck logo on him with Dan Lanning as the head coach. That unlocks a lot more potential in terms of what you can do on the recruiting trail. That's probably what excites me the most. And I am sure that Dan Lanning was thinking about what Ross Douglas can do as a recruiter before he made this hire. That's one of the things for Dan Lanning. He ain't going to hire coaches that can't recruit. Because that's what it starts. You want to win national championships, you got to get the Jimmys and Joes on your roster. I think Ross Douglas will be able to do that. A fascinating, smaller storyline in terms of this hire is he's from the state of Ohio. Who's Oregon's biggest competition going to be? Not only in the Big Ten, but you're talking about national championship competition. It's Ohio State. You got a guy that has roots in the state of Ohio, that has a lot of relationships with the high school coaches in that state. Can you go to the state of Ohio and maybe start plucking some of the best players in that state, specifically at the wide receiver position? That's one of those things where it's not only getting better as a football team, grabbing some really good players, but you keeping those players out of Ohio State. That's big for Oregon. You're talking about competing for national championships. Number 2, player development. You had 5 wide receivers go for over 500 yards, 3 wide receivers go for over 900 yards. They had a lot of wide receivers step up within the Syracuse offense. And I think what excites me the most is what he did with Aronde Gaston at the tight end spot. But they treated Aronde Gaston like a wide receiver. Very, very similar to a football player like Kenyon Sadiq, where it's like this kid, Aronde Gaston, that is, at Syracuse, was just a matchup nightmare, difference maker at that tight end position. And they said, hey, he's not just a tight end. We got to split him out wide. We got to treat him like a wide receiver and let him go be an impact guy for the Syracuse offense. And that's exactly what Aronde Gaston was. Caught for over 900 yards, I believe second in the country at the tight end position. Can you get that kind of play from Kenyon Sadiq, where as talented as Aronde Gaston is, the Oregon fans who've been rocking with me know I think Kenyon Sadiq has the ability to be the best tight end in the country in 2025. Can you have that same impact that Ross Douglas had on Aronde Gaston? Can you have that impact with Kenyon Sadiq? You know, we're talking about what wide receivers are going to step up for Oregon. Well, I would kind of make that conversation bigger and say what pass catchers are going to step up for Oregon. Because I think Kenyon Sadiq can be one of the biggest difference makers for Oregon in the 2025 year. I think the second interesting conversation is who replaces a guy like Tez Johnson? Well, Syracuse kind of had their version of Tez Johnson with Trebor Pena. And so Ross Douglas is going to be able to, hey, you look at a guy like Kenny Sadiq, very similar to Aronde Gaston. You look at a guy like Trebor Pena, very similar to a guy like Tez Johnson. Can Ross Douglas kind of get a Tez Johnson going for Oregon in 2025 as well? He is coming into a wide receiver room that, although might not have the bona fide proven production that Oregon had last year with guys like Holden and Stewart and obviously Tez Johnson, all with this Oregon offense last year, you could make the argument this is just as, if not more talented of a wide receiver room going into 2025. And that's really one of the bigger question marks we have, where it's so much talent in this wide receiver room. Can Ross Douglas maximize it? Because if you maximize it right now on paper, it's probably not going to be talked about as a top 5 wide receiver room in the country. It very well could be by the end of 2025. Can Ross Douglas get this unit to be like that is probably the biggest question mark. And I think he can, given what he did at Syracuse. Former NFL guy as well, which I like. This is a hire that is, I don't know if I'd use the word risky, but it was not necessarily that, oh, yep, that's a consensus top wide receiver coach in the game. You don't talk about Ross Douglas like that because he hasn't been around for that long, but it would not surprise me in the slightest that in 3 years from now, we're talking about Ross Douglas being one of the best wide receivers coach and getting offensive coordinator buzz, because he is one of those coaches that he's young and he's kind of considered one of those rising stars. And Dan Lanning loves to bet on these kind of coaches. I really like this hire. Young, energetic, hungry coach joining a young, energetic Oregon staff. Makes a lot of sense to me. Oregon fans, let it fly in the comment section. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. We'll talk to y'all later.